Hello, everyone. Welcome to my room. I am doing my essay in the form of a video essay, which, it's a very self-explanatory name, just a essay on video, but basically what I'm gonna do here is a little different from your normal essay because it's gonna be very improvised. A lot of video essays I've watched have more of an improvised feel than a scripted feel, which I personally like, and I feel like that is what I want to go for here. So, in this video essay, I will be discussing the poet Hugh Martin. There are several people named Hugh Martin that are famous, but I'm specifically referring to the Hugh Martin that was an Iraqi war veteran and wrote the books In Country, Stick Soldiers, and So How Was the War, which are three books that are poetry collections containing poems about his time serving. Now, originally, I wanted to go more in depth about Hugh Martin's past, but unfortunately, not a lot of that information is publicly available. I couldn't find his age. I couldn't find any information about any family members he has. I couldn't find any information about how many years he's served. Anything about his life before the war, which there wasn't much that I could find. All of it was in interviews, but there isn't really enough to make anything of substance. But yeah, so I can't really go in depth about him, but I can go in depth about his experience during the war. Again, unfortunately, there's not a lot of information online about Hugh Martin, so even his experience during the war isn't very well documented. But luckily, there's an interview he did with arts.gov that he does go a little in depth to about his time serving. So we can glean a lot from that. However, it is to be noted that a lot of his experience is seen through his poetry, which we will get into in a bit. So, Hugh Martin served as part of the Ohio Army National Guard and joined a few months before 9/11. And of course, a big terrorist attack like that is going to shake things up, and before he knows it, in 2004, he's out in Iraq serving in the Iraq War. And he had to pull out of school for this as well, which was very unfortunate. In fact, he didn't really discover poetry as a medium he enjoyed using until he came back and continued his undergrad. But again, that's all the information about his experience that doesn't come from his poetry, but we will examine that stuff later. So far, Hugh Martin has released 3 books. His first book was titled So, How Was the War? And was released in 2010. His second book was Stick Soldiers, released in 2013, and his third was In Country, released in 2018. Stick Soldiers is famous for its poem by the same name, The Stick Soldiers, and In Country has a notable poem known as Iraq Good. As far as So How Was the War, I was not able to find any index of what poems are contained in that book, but I'm sure they're lovely. What I find interesting about the separation of these books is when you study them differently, you will notice a few similarities, but you will definitely notice a few differences. The best example I can think of is in The Stick Soldiers. A lot of the poems are more scrunched together with bigger, longer paragraphs. Things are less spread out over different lines and different stanzas. Whereas in Country, a lot of the stanzas tend to be shorter. A lot of the lines are shorter. Things are more spread out. Ideas are more concise. Whereas you've got things that are basically paragraphs and Stick Soldiers. I feel like in Country you'd be hard pressed to find a stanza that contains more than 3 sentences. But yeah, that's just an interesting difference between the two that I thought was notable. An important similarity to see between two of the books that we read poems from, Stick Soldiers and In Country. Unfortunately, I can't comment very well on So How Was the War, but between these two, all of the poems we read are in the present tense and are about the experiences Hugh Martin had during the war. Everything is written like it's happening now, and nothing is about how he feels before the war, after the war. Everything is during the war, which might not be surprising when you first hear that, but you would think that maybe he would talk about how he feels after the war. And considering the title of So How Was the War, perhaps he goes more into detail about it there. But these two books, everything is about the war itself and not the effects. All the effects this has had on his psyche, the way you understand that is through the mood of the poem, the writing style, instead of the actual narrative being told, which is a very important distinction to make because it helps you understand the poems more. Whereas the actual event is in the writing itself, the effect of that event is in the moods and the tones and the feelings you get from reading it. And that's basically what poetry is all about. Another far smaller detail to note is the fact that out of all of his poems that we've read, none of them talk about the same experience. Every time it's a different experience, it's something new that he hasn't written about. And that's not very surprising, but that just goes to show that there's a lot Hugh Martin has experienced during the war and a lot that has had a chance to have an effect on him. Although it's not very surprising when you take into consideration the amount of experience one would have, and not a lot of people are going to write more than one piece about a single experience, usually. An important thing to note about Hugh Martin's writing style is the way he chooses his words. Again, everything is written in the present tense, which is an interesting thing to note because that's consistent throughout all the poems we've read, but it's important to note that the reason this writing style is chosen is because it invokes a feeling of urgency. Like, this all is happening now, right here. You're facing it right now. It's not something you're reflecting on. It's not something that's in the distant future that's barely a thought in your eye. It is happening now. And it's the most important thing because now is very important. So it gives a sense of urgency to the poems. He also doesn't tend to be very flowery with his words. There's a lot of poets who will go into excess detail or describe things with big, huge words that you have to grab a darn thesaurus to even understand. But as far as Hugh Martin's poetry goes, any average Joe with a decent intelligence on how to speak could pick this up and understand every single word in it. There's no big, stupid, unnecessary words. There's no fluff, basically. There's no filler. There's no fluff. Everything is straightforward, easy to understand, and yet that still gives a sense of urgency, which I like. There is no time to pause and reflect. There's no time to use big fancy words to describe something. You are in war. You don't have time for that. You need to focus and get it done as quick as possible, as concise as possible, because it's urgent. There's a sense of urgency throughout all of these. And that is probably one of the most profound, most notable things about Hugh Martin's writing. It's the thing that stands out the most to me. It's also important to note the feelings you get from these poems, besides that sense of urgency that I've been talking about. For example, Stick Soldiers is a poem all about how kids will draw pictures of soldiers and how when the soldiers go into a different country, the kids do that there too, but they see them drawn as the bad guys, basically, because, kids don't really have that nuanced understanding of war. They just see good guys and bad guys. And in fact, a lot of adults have that too, so it's not super shocking. But there's not going to be a poem that you read by Hugh Martin that's necessarily going to make you very happy. There's not a single poem that's going to just give you a little smile, a little chuckle. This isn't fun poetry. This isn't easy to swallow poetry. This is about difficult to tackle stuff, and that's probably what makes it so good. A lot of good poetry is about difficult things, and there's definitely room for good, happy poetry. In fact, I love that, but poetry is often used as a way to vent or to artistically let out frustrations. You don't really have a lot of happiness in poetry in general terms, especially when it comes to war. I can't imagine how you'd even go about writing a happy poem about war. It can be done probably, but not tastefully, I'd imagine. But yeah, none of these poems are going to make you happy. Hugh Martin also isn't the type of author to shy away from the gross and uncomfortable, which is an often unexplored side of art just because of societal standards. No one really wants to talk about gross stuff. It makes them uncomfortable, but Hugh Martin is willing to talk about things that would make someone uncomfortable, including himself. In fact, a lot of these experiences are, in fact, all of them, not a lot of them, all of them are things that have happened to him, stuff he's had to deal with, stuff that's made him uncomfortable. For example, Frisking Two Men in Sabaya is all about him having to do pat-down searches in Sabaya. There are people he's got to pat down, check for weapons, and the poem outright describes him accidentally brushing his hand against another man's genital area, which, obviously not something you really want to do, not something that's going to make you or the person very comfortable. No one's going to like that. No one's going to like that scenario. That's not a fun place to be in. That's not something someone would usually want to write about because it's gross. It's uncomfortable. And yet he's willing to write about it. He's willing to write about things that would make someone uncomfortable. In another poem of his, First Engagement, the poem ends with him describing popping a zit on the center of someone's back. Again, a very gross, uncomfortable scenario to be in. Pimples are gross. No one likes that. He'll write about crawling through mud. He'll write about having to check out gross, destroyed places that people live in due to the war. Things are often described as rusty, unclean. There's just a lot of general grossness and discomfort in his writing that he's not willing to shy away from, which is something that I feel needs to be shown more in art because it's not really something people talk about as much as you would think. And the fact that he's willing to talk about that is very interesting. It's a very good thematic link between all the poems. They're sad, they're uncomfortable, they're a little gross at times. And yeah, putting all of these elements together, the sadness, the grossness, the discomfort of Hugh Martin's poems, it gives it a really human feel. A lot of other writing will often sugarcoat things, it'll leave out those details. And while this does leave a less discomforting, more appealing reading, of the material. It also gives it more of an unrealistic, glorified feel. It feels unreal, it feels fake, it feels like you're reading about something that just, it can be said it's something that can happen, but it doesn't feel that way. But when you leave in all those details, when you leave in the grossness, the sadness, the discomfort, it feels like something tangible, something that could actually happen to you. And that's where Hugh Martin's poetry shines, in that feeling of discomfort, because it feels real. It doesn't feel like he's making this up. It feels like something he's actually experienced, which of course he has. And leaving in those details far increases that effect. Hugh Martin has said before that in no way does he want to glorify war in his writing. And I'd imagine after going through war and having that experience, having the trauma from that, you definitely wouldn't be looking to glorify something that terrifying, something that messed you up that bad, as war often does to people. So, all that sad discomfort, grossness, it's not sugarcoating anything. It's not going to glorify war. And that's the effect Hugh Martin's poetry gives. Unlike a lot of poets we talk about in English class or any other class in which you discuss poetry, Hugh Martin is still alive to this day. In fact, he's a very recent poet. He's not very old. As far as what we've seen in photos and stuff, he looks around 40 or so, maybe. Of course, having served in the Iraq War, that seems about right. But it's interesting to note that, because a lot of poets, you're not going to have them still be alive. You can't really reach out to a dead guy. And we actually had the privilege of interviewing Hugh Martin. And there isn't really anything from that that I'd like to use in this video essay. Plus, I am planning on posting this publicly on YouTube. I doubt anyone besides my English teacher will watch it, but hey, if you're here, then hello. I don't know why you're wasting your time with this, but go check Hugh Martin's writing out. It's really good. But I believe that video is also public on YouTube. It may be privated, but I'm unsure. But if it is public, I don't want to steal anything from that. I feel that in some sense it's not plagiarism, because I would be citing it, but I still don't feel exactly comfortable with that, if that makes any sense. But you can still talk to Hugh Martin today if you wanted, and like I said, that's what my English class did. That's what we did in class, and we wrote all these questions to him. He answered them, and you don't get a lot of that clarification with what poets mean in their poetry unless they did interviews before they died. So having a living poet is actually quite a lucky and fortunate situation. Currently, he's teaching as an English teacher at the University of Ohio, and he seems to be doing pretty all right, which is good. I hope the best for him. But yeah, so Hugh Martin's writing is all about war and how utterly terrifying and just saddening that experience is, depressing. It's not a fun experience, it's uncomfortable, it's sad, and it's human. Hugh Martin's writing is some of the best poetry I've seen in quite a while, and if you're watching this from anywhere other than my English class, I urge you to go look into more of his poetry. In fact, if you are watching this in my English class, you've read his work. If you like it, I'd say look more into it, because I always encourage looking into things that interest you. You find a lot of new stuff that way. But yeah, that just about wraps it up. I hope you guys enjoyed.